The person the Pima County Sheriff's Office sent to lead the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had never worked a homicide before. Not a difficult homicide, not a cold case, not a disappearance under suspicious circumstances. No homicide? None. The lead investigator assigned to one of the most high-profile kidnapping cases in the country, a case with FBI involvement, ransom notes, and the entire national media watching, had never personally investigated a single homicide case in their career. And the sergeant placed in charge of the unit overseeing that investigator had been a sergeant for less than 6 months, and had also, according to sources close to the investigation, never personally worked a homicide. This is not a rumor. This is not a theory. This is information coming from an insider in law enforcement who sat down exclusively with NewsNation and provided specific details about the composition of the team assigned to Nancy Guthrie's case. Details the sheriff's office has not denied. And it gets worse. Of the 6 detectives on the homicide unit at the time Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home, only one had more than 3 years of experience on the squad. The other 5 had fewer than 2. The team tasked with solving a kidnapping for ransom, a case that required preserving forensic evidence, coordinating with federal agents, and managing an investigation under extraordinary public scrutiny, was, according to this source, among the least experienced possible. That is where we are going today. Not who took Nancy Guthrie, though that remains the central question in this case. Today we are going to look at the system that was supposed to find her, what it was, what it wasn't, and what the consequences of that gap may be. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, and she has been missing since February 1st, 2026, taken from her home in Tucson's Catalina Foothills neighborhood in the middle of the night, in her pajamas, without her shoes, without her phone, without the medication that regulates her pacemaker. Her family has been living in that specific kind of hell that only people in this situation know. Not grief, because grief requires finality, but a suspended state of not knowing that mental health professionals describe as among the most psychologically damaging experiences a family can endure. Your brain cannot stop running scenarios because there is no answer to stop it. Before she was a case number, Nancy Guthrie was a woman living in a house she knew, a woman whose daughter anchored the morning news, a woman whose son, Cameron, a career military intelligence officer, identified within hours of her disappearance that this was a targeted kidnapping for ransom. Not a random crime, not a break-in gone wrong, but a planned operation directed at a specific person. She was the kind of 84-year-old who kept a routine, who had a home with back doors and front doors and a ring camera that was recording, who neighbors recognized, whose life was embedded in a neighborhood and a family. None of that protected her. And for over 60 days, the question of who came through those doors and what happened to her afterward has remained unanswered. For 60 days, the investigation has been in the hands of the Pima County Sheriff's Office and, separately, the FBI. And what this week's reporting has revealed is that those two entities are not equivalent, not in experience, not in resources, and not in what they appear to have brought to this case from the beginning. If you've been following the Nancy Guthrie case and you want every update as it develops, and the developments right now are moving faster than they have at any point since the early days, subscribe to this channel. I cover this investigation every time something significant breaks, and what is happening this week is significant enough that you need to know about it. Let's lay out exactly what we know, where it came from, and what it means for this investigation. The source who spoke to NewsNation is described as someone close to the investigation, an insider in the law enforcement community who has direct knowledge of how the Pima County Sheriff's Office responded to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. This person spoke on the condition of anonymity, and NewsNation said it protected their identity specifically because of the risk of retaliation for speaking out. That detail matters more than it might seem. This is not someone with an axe to grind doing an on-camera interview under their own name. This is not an outside critic or a political opponent. This is someone who works or has worked inside the law enforcement structure surrounding this case, who believes something went wrong, and who felt the information needed to be public badly enough to accept personal risk to share it. People do not take that kind of risk unless what they know is serious. What they described, in specific terms, is this. The investigators who first responded to Nancy Guthrie's home were, in the source's words, inexperienced. The lead detective had never investigated a homicide. The supervising sergeant had fewer than 6 months in that supervisory role and had never personally worked a homicide case before being placed over this unit. And of the remaining detectives, 5 of the 6 had fewer than 2 years of homicide experience. Now, you might hear that and think, this is a kidnapping, not a homicide, so maybe homicide experience isn't the right benchmark. And that is a reasonable thing to think, and it deserves a direct answer. Here is why it matters enormously. A kidnapping for ransom, especially one with the complexity this case has shown. Masked intruders, propped doors, ring camera footage, ransom notes with inside knowledge of the property, possible multiple suspects operating in coordinated roles, is forensically among the most demanding crime scenes a department can respond to. The decisions made in the first hours determine what evidence survives. They determine what gets documented before it is disturbed. They determine the integrity of the chain of custody that makes the difference between evidence that is admissible in court and evidence that is not. An investigator on their first complex case does not know what they do not know. That is not an insult. It is simply true. And in the first hours of a kidnapping for ransom, what you do not know you need to do can close doors permanently. The former Pima County Sheriff and other critics of Sheriff Chris Nanos have used a specific word to describe what happened to Nancy Guthrie's crime scene: corrupted. A former Pima County Sheriff, speaking publicly about the handling of this case, said, and I want to quote this directly because it is extraordinary, "That crime scene was corrupted. You had people delivering pizzas. How do we know this is real evidence? Once it has been corrupted, that's the end of it." People delivering pizzas to an active kidnapping crime scene. That is not a metaphor. That is a specific allegation that the physical space where Nancy Guthrie was taken was not properly secured in the hours after she was reported missing, and that unnecessary foot traffic compromised the forensic integrity of the scene. The phrase, "How do we know this is real evidence?" is the sentence I want you to hold on to, because that is the downstream consequence of a compromised scene. It is not just that evidence might have been lost, it is that the evidence that remains may be harder to defend in court, because the chain of custody, the documented, unbroken record of who handled what and when, may have been interrupted. Sheriff Nanos opened the crime scene in the early days of the investigation before attempting to resecure it. Legal analyst Nancy Grace called for his resignation over it on national television. Mark Garagos, appearing on NewsNation, called the crime scene the single biggest failure in the early handling of the case and used the word pristine, not to describe what the scene was, but to describe what it needed to be and wasn't. A pristine crime scene is one where every fiber, every biological trace, every fingerprint, every surface contact is preserved exactly as the crime left it. That is the standard this case required. According to multiple critics with direct forensic knowledge, it is not the standard this case received. Let me put some numbers around what forensic contamination actually means in practice, because I think the abstract language around it understates the real problem. When investigators process a crime scene, they are looking for biological material, skin cells, hair follicles, saliva, sweat, that was deposited by the people who were present during the crime. In a home invasion and kidnapping, the suspect or suspects would have been moving through that space for some amount of time, touching surfaces, breathing, potentially leaving trace evidence on every doorframe and floor and piece of furniture they contacted. That material, if collected cleanly, can yield a DNA profile. A DNA profile from a crime scene, compared against profiles in a database or matched through genetic genealogy, is among the most powerful tools in modern criminal investigation. But here is what contamination does to that process. Every person who walks through a crime scene after the crime, but before the scene is fully processed, adds their DNA to the environment. Every investigator who removes their gloves for a moment. Every family member who runs through the house calling out a name. Every person who delivers food to first responders stationed outside and wanders too close to the door. Each of those incursions adds biological material that was not there when the crime occurred. When the lab processes the samples, they now have to work through a mixture of profiles. Some of those profiles are in databases and can be identified and eliminated. Some are not. And some of the original suspect's material, if it was present in small quantities to begin with, may now be impossible to separate cleanly from the noise. That is the scenario that the former sheriff's statement, "How do we know this is real evidence?" was describing. Not that the evidence is fake, that its forensic integrity has been compromised in ways that may make it harder to use, harder to attribute, and harder to defend in court. To understand how significant this is, you need to understand what the investigation is currently relying on forensically. The FBI is reportedly processing biological samples from the scene at 2 separate laboratories. The involvement of 2 labs strongly suggests the use of genetic genealogy, the technique that identified the Golden State Killer after 4 decades by matching partial DNA to public genealogy databases, building family trees, and narrowing the pool of potential suspects down to a single individual. That process is remarkable, but it depends entirely on the quality of the biological material collected at the scene. DNA that has been contaminated with contributions from multiple people who had no connection to the crime is harder to isolate, harder to match, and harder to present in court without creating the kind of reasonable doubt that defense attorneys live for. The cleanliness of those samples is not a secondary concern. In this investigation, it may be the only path to an identification, and the cleanliness of those samples was potentially compromised before investigators fully understood what they had. Subscribe right now if you want to stay with this story, because there is more coming and the timeline is accelerating toward a point of real accountability. Here is where things stand on the broader picture, because the inexperience of the investigation team is one piece of a much larger pattern that has been building for weeks. Sheriff Chris Nanos is facing a recall. A petition was filed on March 12th by a former congressional candidate who stated publicly that he believes Nanos botched the Nancy Guthrie investigation, and that the botching began not with a single decision, but with the foundational choices made in the first hours. The recall effort has gathered significant public momentum, driven partly by the national attention the case has received and partly by the accumulating weight of the specific allegations against the department's handling of it. In March, the Pima County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to invoke a rare territorial-era law, a law that dates back to before Arizona was even a state, requiring Nanos to testify under oath about his conduct and his career. A hearing is scheduled within days. Arizona's Board of Supervisors does not pull a law from the pre-statehood era lightly. The fact that they voted unanimously to use it signals that the board believes the normal mechanisms for accountability, press conferences, public statements, standard oversight, are not sufficient for what they are looking at. Requiring someone to testify under oath, specifically, is the difference between asking and compelling. It removes the option of strategic silence, and in a case where the sheriff's credibility is already seriously compromised, compelling testimony under oath is a deliberate escalation by the people responsible for overseeing him, and the credibility issue is not minor. In December 2025, Nanos testified under oath that he had never been suspended as a law enforcement officer. That was the testimony. The Arizona Republic subsequently published El Paso Police Department records showing he had been suspended 8 times between 1976 and 1982. 8 times. The documented reasons include excessive force and tardiness. He was suspended 8 times as a police officer and then testified under oath that he had never been suspended. That is not a misremembering. That is not ambiguity about what the question meant. That is a statement that is directly and specifically contradicted by official records obtained by a major newspaper. The gap between what he said under oath and what the records show is the foundation of the oath hearing. It is why the Board of Supervisors felt compelled to invoke a law that has not been regularly used since Arizona was a territory. The deputies union, representing more than 300 officers in his own department, held a vote of no confidence. The final tally: 241 deputies voted for no confidence and resign. 65 abstained. 0 voted confidence. His own department's rank and file, the officers who work under him every day, who know what the culture of that department is and how decisions are made inside it, voted overwhelmingly for him to resign over this case. I want to spend a moment on what that vote actually represents, because it is easy to treat it as a political story and miss what it actually is. 241 sworn law enforcement officers looked at the leadership of their department, looked at what happened in this case, and voted for their own sheriff to resign. These are not advocates. These are not reporters. These are not critics with a platform to protect. These are people who put on a badge and go to work, and who decided, by an overwhelming margin, that the person leading their department had failed in a way that could not be absorbed into normal institutional friction. When law enforcement's own rank and file says publicly that they have lost confidence, that is not a political statement. That is a professional one. It means the people closest to the work believe the leadership is compromised. And in an active investigation of this magnitude, that matters. There is a broader context to what the Pima County Sheriff's Office is, and understanding it helps explain how a department ends up in this position. Pima County covers Tucson and the surrounding area, a jurisdiction with real crime, real resources, and a department that has historically handled complex investigations. This is not a small rural department that has never seen a serious case. This is a department that, on paper, should have had the capacity to respond to a kidnapping of this complexity. The fact that it apparently did not, that the unit assigned to the most visible case in its recent history was staffed almost entirely by detectives with fewer than 2 years of homicide experience, led by a sergeant with fewer than 6 months in the role, raises a question that goes beyond the Nancy Guthrie case specifically. How did the unit get to that point? One possible answer is organizational. If experienced detectives were moved out of the unit, if the Homicide Division experienced turnover or a restructuring in the months before February 2026, the team composition the source described would make sense as an outcome. An inexperienced team is not built by accident. It is built by the decisions, or the absence of decisions, that preceded it. And the question of who made those decisions and whether those decisions are part of the pattern of leadership failures that the no-confidence vote and the recall reflect is one that the oath hearing may be positioned to force into the public record. What you have is not a single failure. It is a cascading institutional failure with a specific shape. An inexperienced team assigned on day one. A crime scene that, according to a former sheriff and multiple legal analysts, was compromised before the forensic picture was complete. A sheriff with a documented disciplinary history he did not disclose under oath. A department so fractured in its confidence in his leadership that the officers themselves are demanding he step down. Each of those failures connects to the others. The inexperience of the team made the crime scene decisions worse. The crime scene decisions made the forensic evidence harder to use. The sheriff's credibility problems made it harder for the department to defend its decisions publicly. And all of it happened while Nancy Guthrie was missing and the clock was running. The question this raises, and I think it is the central question for anyone following this investigation, is what the consequences of those early failures actually are. Not politically, forensically. Because the politics of a recall hearing, however dramatic, are ultimately about the future of one man's career. The forensics are about Nancy Guthrie. Let me walk through the 3 most consequential early decisions and what each of them may have cost. The first is the crime scene itself. Forensic contamination is not reversible. Once a scene has been compromised by unauthorized foot traffic, by the wrong people handling the wrong surfaces, by the introduction of biological material that was not there when the crime occurred, you cannot go back and clean it. You can document what you find, flag its possible contamination, and let the lab work determine what is usable. But the evidence that was cleanly attributable to the suspect on the night of the crime and is now mixed with other contributions, that evidence may never be cleanly separable. In a genetic genealogy investigation, the starting material has to be identified and isolated with enough confidence to begin the matching process. If the biological samples from Nancy Guthrie's home are contaminated, the genealogy work is not impossible, but it is harder, slower, and more vulnerable to challenge at trial. The second is the team assignment. There is a principle in complex investigations that experience compounds. An investigator who has worked 100 difficult scenes knows intuitively what 100 different failures look like and knows what corrective action each one demands. They have made the mistake of stepping on a piece of evidence and learned from it. They have failed to document something in the right order and learned what that costs later. They know when to call for help. They know what help to call. An investigator on their first case of this complexity does not have that library. They are making decisions from first principles in real time, under pressure, with a national audience and a federal partner watching. That is not a context in which inexperience produces good outcomes. The third is the oversight structure. The supervising sergeant had less than 6 months in the role, which means the person responsible for identifying gaps in the initial response, for recognizing when a detective was out of their depth and needed support, for making the call to bring in additional expertise, for catching the mistakes before they became permanent. That person was also, effectively, learning on the job at the supervisory level. There was no experienced hand at the top of the unit to catch what the less experienced investigators might have missed. In a well-functioning department, that oversight is the safety net. Here, according to the source, the safety net did not exist. There is also the question of what a better response would have looked like, because I think that question is worth asking directly. A kidnapping for ransom with evidence of planning, coordination, and insider knowledge of the target property. The ransom notes that contained specific details about the layout of Nancy's home, details that only someone who had been inside or conducted close-range surveillance would know, is the kind of case that activates major crimes units, federal resources, and experienced supervisory oversight from the first call. It is a case where the first decision is not who is available, but who is the most qualified. Where the crime scene is locked down before anyone not in a forensic suit gets near a doorframe. Where the chain of custody documentation begins from the moment the first officer arrives. Where the sergeant on the scene has worked enough complex cases to know what questions to ask before the initial walkthrough is complete. That is what the standard looks like. The source's account suggests what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home fell short of it in ways that were not incidental, but structural. Former prosecutor Matt Murphy, speaking publicly about this case in recent weeks, used the phrase "clown show" to describe the investigation's institutional management. He said he would bet his bottom dollar that the suspect is a known individual within Pima County's criminal ecosystem. Someone with a record, someone who has been in the system, someone who, under a properly functioning investigation with experienced personnel, might have been identified far more quickly than the current timeline reflects. That is his read of the evidence. But it comes from someone with prosecutorial experience, and it reflects a reading that takes the institutional failures seriously as factors in why 60 days have passed without an arrest. And here is the detail from the NewsNation exclusive that has not received nearly enough attention. The source who spoke about the inexperience of the investigation team also said they had a message for Savannah Guthrie. A message. That detail, placed at the end of the report, is the one I keep returning to. A law enforcement insider who is willing to risk retaliation to go on record about the failures in this case has a specific message for the family of the victim. We do not know what that message is. NewsNation has not reported it in full. But consider what that means. A person with direct knowledge of what happened inside this investigation, who has seen the decisions that were made and the decisions that were not made, who knows what the first responders found and how they handled it, who understands what was preserved and what was not. That person wants Savannah Guthrie to know something specific, something they believe she should know, something important enough to include in an anonymous interview about the failures of the department. I do not know what it is. And that fact, more than any other single detail in this week's reporting, is the one that sits with me. There is one more dimension to this story that I want to address directly before we get to the current status of the investigation, because it is something I see mischaracterized in the coverage of this case. The criticism of Sheriff Nanos and the Pima County Sheriff's Office is not the same as saying the FBI has failed. The two entities are operating separately, and the FBI's involvement in this case is, if anything, evidence that the federal assessment of the situation is that the case demands resources beyond what the county can provide on its own. FBI agents do not embed in a state-level investigation as a courtesy. They do it because there is something there that warrants federal-level attention. In this case, a kidnapping for ransom that crosses jurisdictional lines involves sophisticated planning and carries the kind of evidentiary complexity that the FBI's specialized resources are built for. The FBI is not subject to the no-confidence vote. The FBI is not the target of the recall petition. The FBI is not the entity that opened the crime scene before its forensic processing was complete. The FBI came in after. What the FBI is working with is whatever the crime scene had left to offer at the point of their involvement, plus the surveillance footage, the ransom notes, the staging location evidence, and the DNA samples, some of which were presumably collected before the contamination occurred, and some of which may carry the uncertainty that comes from a scene that was not handled by the book from the first hour. The FBI's capabilities are not in doubt. What is in question is the quality of the starting material they were handed. Here is what the current status of the investigation looks like, separated from the politics. The FBI remains involved. FBI involvement in a state-level missing persons case is not standard. It indicates that federal agents have assessed the situation and determined that their resources and jurisdiction are warranted, and that the state-level response alone is not sufficient. The FBI does not answer to the Pima County Sheriff. Their investigation runs independently, and their forensic work continues regardless of what happens at the recall hearing or the oath testimony. The genetic genealogy processing is ongoing. DNA takes weeks. Genealogy matching takes months. The investigation that the public can see is running on a significant delay from the investigation that is actually happening inside the labs and inside the case files. The $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's safe return remains active. The family's most recent public statement asked Tucson residents specifically for any footage or information from January 11th, the late evening and early morning of January 31st and February 1st, and the days in between. They are still asking. They have been asking for 60 days. Because someone in that community saw something. A car that did not belong, a person walking at an unusual hour, a conversation that made someone uneasy, and may not yet understand that what they saw is relevant. Investigators have also disclosed that they are looking at a vacant home near Nancy's residence as a possible staging location used by the suspect or suspects in the lead-up to the abduction. A staging location is where an operation is prepared and launched from. If the FBI has identified a specific property as a potential staging location, it means they have evidence suggesting someone was using that property during the surveillance period. Footprints, tire marks, cell tower data, biological material, and unlike Nancy's home, a staging location that has been identified and secured before significant contamination occurred could be a cleaner evidence source. One that does not carry the same chain of custody concerns that have been raised about the primary crime scene. Whether Nanos survives the recall hearing has no direct bearing on the FBI investigation. The federal work does not stop because a county sheriff faces political accountability. But what the recall process does, if it proceeds fully, is expose the institutional record of this department's handling of this case to a level of scrutiny that a standard press conference cannot achieve. And in a case where the failures are alleged to be systemic, not one mistake, but a pattern of decisions made by people who were not prepared to make them. That level of public record may be the most consequential form of accountability available short of an indictment. I want to spend a moment on what 60 days actually means for a family living through this, because I think the coverage sometimes moves so quickly through the investigative developments that it loses sight of the human reality underneath all of it. 60 days of not knowing whether someone you love is alive. 60 days of waking up and the first conscious thought being the same question that has no answer. 60 days of watching the news for your own mother's name. 60 days of answering the phone and not knowing if this call is the one. Mental health professionals who work with families of missing persons describe what happens over time in terms that are almost clinical in their precision. The initial surge of adrenaline and action gives way around the 2-week mark to a kind of sustained hypervigilance that the body cannot maintain indefinitely. Families in this situation often report deteriorating sleep, difficulty concentrating, an inability to make ordinary decisions, and a fractured relationship with time. Every day that passes without resolution feels simultaneously endless and insufficient. There is no rest that actually restores because the part of the brain monitoring for information never fully disengages. Savannah Guthrie has gone on national television every weekday morning for 60 days. That is not a trivial thing. It is not performance. It is the decision to keep going because the alternative, what exactly? Collapse? Disappear from public life and wait in silence? Does not serve her mother. It is a choice made under conditions of sustained grief that most people will never experience, and it is worth naming that plainly. Cameron Guthrie, her brother, identified within hours of Nancy's disappearance that this was a targeted kidnapping for ransom. A career in military intelligence produces a specific kind of pattern recognition, and he applied it immediately. The family cooperated with investigators from the beginning. They took and passed polygraphs. They made public appeals. They offered $1 million in reward money. They asked the community directly, by name, to search their memories. They have done everything within their power, and they have done it while under the specific weight of not knowing whether any of it is enough. What they were owed from the institutional side of this, from the county, from the department, from the sheriff, who is the public face of the investigation, was a response equal to what they were living through. An experienced team, a clean crime scene, a sheriff whose credibility under oath was intact. That is not a high bar. That is the minimum. The Guthrie family said on day 50 that they cannot grieve. They can only ache and wonder. Those words deserve to be held carefully, because everything we have covered in this video, the inexperience, the crime scene, the oath testimony, the no confidence vote, the recall, the staging location, the message an insider wants Savannah to hear. Those are not abstract institutional failures. They are failures that are happening to a specific family on specific days, while a woman they love is missing and no one can tell them where she is or what condition she is in, or whether the investigation that is supposed to find her was built on solid ground from the beginning. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for over 60 days. Her daughter goes on national television every morning and does the work, because what else do you do when the alternative is sitting in a room with a phone that is not ringing? Her son identified this as a targeted kidnapping for ransom within hours of her disappearance, with the kind of clarity that comes from a career in military intelligence. The family has cooperated fully. They have passed polygraphs. They have made public appeals repeatedly. They have offered $1 million. They have asked the community for help. They have done everything a family in this situation can do. And they are owed, at minimum, an investigation that was built on experience from the first hour of the first day. According to the source who spoke to NewsNation, it wasn't. Let me lay out clearly where each of the 4 accountability threads currently stands as of today, because they are moving simultaneously and at different speeds, and it is easy to lose track of which is which. The recall petition against Sheriff Nanos was filed March 12th and is building toward a formal hearing. A recall does not automatically remove a sheriff. It initiates a process that requires signatures, verification, and ultimately a vote. But the petition itself, combined with the no confidence vote and the oath hearing, creates a form of sustained institutional pressure that forces the department's handling of this case into the public record in a way that a standard investigation does not. The oath hearing is the most immediately consequential. Testifying under oath about conduct that is directly contradicted by documented records creates legal exposure. The gap between Nanos's testimony about his disciplinary record and what the Arizona Republic found is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of what the records say. That hearing, when it occurs, will produce sworn testimony that is on the record permanently. The FBI investigation is its own thread, running independently of all of it and on its own timeline. Genetic genealogy, surveillance footage, the staging location, the ransom notes, the Uber footage from the day before Nancy disappeared. These are not things that stop because a county sheriff is in political trouble. They are the things that may ultimately determine whether this case is solved. And the fourth thread is the source who spoke to NewsNation, the insider with a message for Savannah Guthrie. Whatever that message is, whether it is an apology, a warning, information the family does not yet have, something about the investigation that the insider believes has been handled wrongly, it is out there. It has been said to a reporter, and it has not yet been fully reported. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to read your answer in the comments. The institutional failures in this investigation, the inexperienced team, the compromised crime scene, the sheriff's documented credibility problems, the deputy's own no-confidence vote. Do you believe those failures have materially delayed justice for Nancy Guthrie and potentially damaged the evidence that could lead to an arrest? Or do you believe the FBI's independent involvement and the forensic work that is still actively ongoing means the early mistakes can be overcome? That the evidence collected separately, the genealogy work, the staging location, the surveillance footage are enough to carry this case to a resolution regardless of what the sheriff's office did or didn't do in the first days? Because those two positions lead to very different conclusions about what accountability looks like here and what the Guthrie family is owed beyond a resolution. And I think that tension between what the FBI may still be able to prove and what was potentially lost in the first hours is the real story of where this investigation stands right now. Tell me what you think. I read every comment, and in a case this important, every perspective matters. Subscribe to this channel if you want to be here when this breaks. I post every update as it develops, and based on everything moving right now, the recall hearing, the oath testimony, the FBI work continuing in the background, and the message an insider wants the Guthrie family to hear, this case is not slowing down. It is accelerating towards something. Next time, we are looking at a case where the evidence was collected perfectly, the suspect was identified quickly, and the system still failed the victim in the most preventable way possible.